Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. Okay, Hassan's giving me the thumb up. Okay, let's try that again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.
Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I'm just going to check something real quick. Where is my dear student, soon to be Maulana Amjad and already Maulana Muhammad Hamid? Are you here?
Yes.
Is there any way for me to communicate with you guys?
I don't know how this is going to work.
We are on a mic system. Can you hear us?
I see. Okay.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, Amjad.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Okay. All right. If it's okay, I'm going to keep you right here. Otherwise, what it feels like is, see, there's no crowd in front of me here. It's just my bedroom. And, you know, it kind of gets lonely here. So if I have one or two of my students at least connecting with me, it feels like there's a human touch and I can actually get my message across effectively, inshallah. I wish that I could have been there in person in Masjid Darussalam. I mean, those of the people in Masjid Darussalam who know me very well know how connected I am to this blessed place. And this morning, unfortunately, you know, we had plans. My plan was to come in person and meet all you wonderful people. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had other plans. And no matter how depressed it makes me, we are always content with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses for us. However, this does pose a bit of a problem, my dear respected brothers, elders, and sisters. Initially, I had planned to speak to you in person, and when you do that, see, there's like a different type of vibe. I can see you, I can interact with the wonderful people, I can see if you're getting bored or sleepy, or if somebody has a quizzical look, they have any questions. But right now, I'm kind of like a blind man going into the room and trying to get a feel of how the energy is. So I will try my best, inshallah. But nonetheless, I'm grateful to Mufti Minhaj Sahib for nonetheless giving me this opportunity to address you wonderful people. And I believe that even though I'm not anyone significant, but the person that I want to speak about today is indeed very significant. And the lessons that we can derive from his life story, from his achievements, and from his long-term strategic vision for the Ummah, I personally do believe that if studied well, we can, inshallah, implement them in our modern context today. And the person that I do want to speak about is, of course, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. And the interesting thing about him is that for a couple of hundred years after his demise, historians say that in the collective psyche of the Muslims, Salahuddin Ayyubi kind of took a backseat. What happened is that Masjid Al-Aqsa, Jerusalem, Philistine were back in the hands of the Muslims, and the Crusaders became a gradually distant memory of the medieval era. So Muslims in the 17 and 1800s, they didn't invoke the memory of Salahuddin Ayyubi as often as we do today. But of course, in events that happened during the 20th century with the rise of Zionism and the current genocide that is unfolding live on social media before our eyes, Salahuddin Ayyubi in recent decades, and even more so today, has taken center spot in analyzing his life achievements, and in trying to decode and understand what his vision was, and in order to implement that so we can achieve the same goal of repossessing Masjid Al-Aqsa once again. So what follows, inshallah, is my humble assessment of Salahuddin Ayyubi and collectively the Muslims of his time, the efforts that they made in order to take back Jerusalem from the hands of the non-Muslims of that time, who had done great oppression amongst the Muslims. And you can feel free to disagree with me. There are many theories out there, many different types of assessments, but I hope that inshallah, whatever I do have to say will be beneficial, and whatever mistakes there may be, the mistakes are mine alone. All credit goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if anybody disagrees, feel free to reach out to me and give your alternative theories. I'm very interested in hearing that as well. But today I hope that my perspective would shed some light on the events of his life, inshallah. Usually when we speak about Salahuddin Ayyubi, we tend to focus a lot on the battles. We tend to focus a lot on the drama. When the swords are drawn, it's all very interesting and it inspires us, inspires the hearts of the Muslims, especially in these times. However, I'm not going to focus too much on battles during this talk. Just perhaps at the end, we're going to focus on one particular battle. I want to draw an outline of his overall strategy that I believe he implemented over a period of 20 years. And it goes without saying that Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah was an incredibly pious individual, a very spiritual individual. I mean, the history books are replete with testimonials about his piety and his dedication to ibadah and to worship. And we may touch upon a few aspects of his piety, but for today I want to focus on a different aspect that I feel goes unmentioned with regards to his strategies. So without further ado, inshallah, I'm going to now turn off my camera and I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow along this discussion through my notes. What I also advise, brothers and sisters, is that if possible, have your own pencil and a piece of paper, a loose piece of paper, and try to write your own notes as well, because I will try to resist the temptation of trying to convey all the information available at once, whatever I do happen to know. I don't want to overwhelm anybody because what's going to happen is that the lesson will become lost in the details. But rather, what I want to do is to highlight certain aspects to create a larger picture and a context of the events that we're going to speak about today. So in order to do that, it'll be very helpful if you can follow along and also write your own notes as well, inshallah. And at the end, we can discuss further in the Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to now turn off my video and I'm going to share my screen. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Amjad, if you can give me a thumbs up, can you see my notes on the video?
Yes, we can.
Okay, Jazakullahu Khairun. All right. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now, I think it's very important that in order to understand the significance of any achievement in history, any feat, we need to get some background information. I'll give you guys an example, okay? Everybody here is aware that the Prophet ﷺ entered Mecca at the head of 12,000 soldiers and conquered it without a single fight. And then when the people of Quraysh, the non-Muslims, were presented before him, instead of slaughtering them, instead of executing them, instead of punishing them, the Prophet ﷺ forgave them. Now this in of itself is impressive. It's a very unique feature of Rasulullah ﷺ's character. But in order to highlight the exact nature of this forgiveness, you have to paint a very vivid picture of what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Ummah went through before that moment, before Fathu Makkah, before the conquest of Mecca. For example, usually if you were to proceed the discussion of the conquest of Mecca with a recounting of how the beloved uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was so close to him, Hamza radiallahu anhu, was slaughtered and his body was mutilated. And when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came upon that mutilated body of Hamza, how much grief it had caused him, and how much he had cried and sobbed, and how many tears he had shed. When you think about this background detail, the context, and then you go back a couple of years into the future, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is now standing victorious before the people of Mecca, and Hind and Wahshi, the perpetrators of that mutilation of Hamza, are presented before him, and he forgives them. It highlights and thrusts into detail the unique features of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's akhlaq, his achievements, and his actions. So likewise, to understand what Salahuddin Ayyubi had achieved, I think it's very necessary for us to be able to gauge exactly what occurred centuries, even millennia prior to Salahuddin Ayyubi's birth. So what I'm going to suggest, and how this is going to read, brothers and sisters, is more like a analysis. Okay? I'm not going to focus too much on trying to tell a story, although I think that's important and that it is beneficial, but I want specific lessons to be taken away from here. So what we're going to do is that first we're going to try to understand the events that occurred before the life of Salahuddin Ayyubi. And I'm going to take you back approximately 3,500 years before. So with regards to Masjid Al-Aqsa, and the various hands that it had passed through, many kings, many peoples, many ethnic groups had come to rule that holy city over the past 3,500 years. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to divide that period of Masjid Al-Aqsa into three eras. And I'm going to do this based on the three Abrahamic religions. Because today, Jerusalem and all its controversies are relevant to these three major religions. So the first one I categorize as the Jewish period, the second one is the Christian period, and the third one is the Islamic period. Okay, so let's recount that. So first, what happened is after Musa alayhi salatu wassalam had delivered the Bani Israel, the Jews, the descendants of Ishaq alayhi salam, from Egypt, from the hands of the Pharaoh, and brought them to the promised land, which we now call Philistine, Palestine today. The Bani Israel settled down there, and over many generations after Musa alayhi salam, they gradually established a kingdom. One of their first kings was none other than our prophet Dawood alayhi salam, succeeded by his son Sulaiman alayhi salam. And this was approximately 1,000 years before Isa alayhi salam's time. So this is about 3,000 years ago. So this is about 3,000 years ago. Okay, so let's write here 1,000 BC. 1,000 BC. And the Jews ruled here for a couple of hundred years. And in that time, the Bani Israel became divided as a kingdom as well. So the Jewish kingdom became divided into two. You had the northern half and you had the southern half. In the year 722 BC, there was this one other kingdom in the region of Iraq called the Assyrians. They came and they conquered the northern half of the Jewish kingdom. they slaughtered all the Jews, and they completely ended that kingdom and took power. So the northern half came to an end in 722 BC. After the Assyrians, in the year 586 BC, the Babylonians, they were also from the area of Iraq, under the king Nebuchadnezzar. In Persian they called him Bukht Nasr. He came and he conquered the south of Jerusalem. Sorry, the south of the Jewish kingdom. And this event is a very prominent event that occurred in Jewish history, because after this time, the Jews almost continuously lost rule of their homeland. So this happened about 2,500 years ago. This was the era of Uzair alayhi salam. And the events are mentioned in their Torah as well. After this period, after the Babylonians, there were many other ethnic groups that had come to rule. You had the Persians who came, right? The Persians in 536 BC. They had one amazing king, a Persian king named Cyrus. And according to most accounts, Cyrus was a relatively just king. He didn't believe in oppression like the Babylonians did. And he let the Jews free, and the Jews returned to the land of Israel, the land of Palestine. And they were not able to establish another kingdom. The Persians continued to still rule them, and then it passed to the Greeks. And after the Greeks, for a short time, the Jews were able to take power, for maybe 100 years. But then after that, it came under Roman rule. Right? So it changed hands many times throughout this short duration of about 1,000 years. Around just before the era of Isa alayhi salam, 2,000 years ago, the Romans, who were pagans, the Romans used to worship statues and idols, they came to rule Israel. Now throughout this entire period, I'm talking about the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans, with the sole exception of the Persians, every other kingdom that came to rule the Bani Israel persecuted the Jews, mass slaughtered them, genocided them. I'll give you an example. What the Greeks used to do, the Seleucids, is that they used to mock the Bani Israel, and they used to march into their masjid, Masjid Al-Aqsa, which was built by Sulaiman alayhi salam. And they would trample on it with their shoes. They would sacrifice animals to their idols in the masjid. And they would mock the tawheed of the Jews and would persecute them. And it's very ironic, because this is exactly what the modern state of Israel is now doing to the true monotheists, the Muslims in Masjid Al-Aqsa. They march in with their boots, they persecute the Muslims while they're praying in the masjid, they ban them from going inside in Ramadan, they harass the women in the female side. It's just history repeating itself. The Romans were no better. The Romans actually, what they did is that during their rule, after Isa alayhi salam had returned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala somewhere in the skies, the Romans had actually banned Jews. So the Romans banned Jews. They banned Jews from ever coming to Jerusalem in Masjid Al-Aqsa. And this happened around the year 177 AD. 177 AD. Okay? I hope everyone is following. All right, stick with me. After the Jews were banned in 177 AD, so that's about 1900 years ago, the Romans then became Christian. The Roman Empire used to be a pagan empire that worshipped idols. But within 300 years after Isa alayhi salam had returned to Allah, somewhere in the skies, he had ascended into the skies, ironically, the Romans came to adopt the religion of Christianity. Now, this wasn't the same religion that Isa alayhi salam had preached. We know that. Because Isa alayhi salam did not preach the Trinity. Isa alayhi salam did not preach that he was the Son of God. The version of Christianity that the Romans had now adopted, right, in the year 312, about 312, was a version far removed from the original teachings of Isa alayhi salam. Anyhow, So now Masjid al-Aqsa came under Christian control in the name of the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire. And what did they do to the Jews? They did exactly what the pagans did. They continued to ban the Jews from coming to Jerusalem and persecute them and treat them like they were filth. Right? They genocided them in large numbers. Many incidents had occurred. And this carried on for some time. Shortly after this, shortly after Rome had become Christian, the Roman Empire divided into two. The Roman Empire divided into two. Okay, divided into two. It became so massive that it actually became difficult to now rule over the entire empire. So the Romans then became what's known as the Western and the Eastern Empire. So let me try to give you an idea of that. Oops. Eastern, Roman, Western. Sorry. So as you can see, this is what the Roman Empire came to look like around the year in the 380s. So over here is the eastern side, over here is the western side. This bit of detail is significant because the Western Roman Empire over here, it actually collapsed. You know, its center was in Rome. It ceased to exist in the year 476 AD. This is approximately 100 years before the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So 100 years before the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, and the eastern half continued to exist. So by the way, when we read stories of Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajma'een, fighting the Romans, fighting the Christians, we are referring to the eastern half of the empire that continued to survive. And as you can see, it's the eastern half of the Roman Christian Empire that came to control this part over here, the land of Philistine, Sham. Okay? I hope everyone understands that point. So this is how the Roman Empire became divided into two. So it became divided into two, and the eastern half continued to rule Masjid al-Aqsa. Now, this is where we enter the third period, the Islamic period. Up until this point, just to summarize, the Jewish period, where they either maintained control or they remained as a persecuted minority, but still with access to Jerusalem, that lasted for about 1,000 years. And successive groups had come to rule the Jews and persecute them. Then we enter the second period where the Christians now come to control Masjid al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. And this period lasted for approximately 200 or 300 years. Now, while the Eastern Roman Empire ruled Masjid al-Aqsa, this is where the Rashidun era begins. First, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, after the demise of Rasulullah becomes Khalifa, and he rules for a glorious 2 years. In the 2 years that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu became Khalifa, he prepared the ground for the Muslims to now start taking parts of the Persian Empire as well as the Roman Empire. When his successor, Umar radiallahu anhu, had come to power, he took Jerusalem and Masjid al-Aqsa from the Christians, from the Eastern Roman Empire, virtually without bloodshed. And what did Umar radiallahu anhu do? I believe it was in the year 639. What did he do as soon as he took back Jerusalem? He allowed the Jews to finally worship freely in Masjid al-Aqsa. So think about how long after the Jews finally had access. It was around 177 AD, 177 AD, that the Jews were banned from Masjid al-Aqsa. And Umar radiallahu anhu took Masjid al-Aqsa approximately 500 years later. Approximately 500 years later. And prior to this time, the Jews were still being persecuted for virtually most of their existence throughout the 1,000 years before the Roman Empire. The point I'm trying to make is, for the first time in almost 1,500 years, under the safety guaranteed by Umar radiallahu anhu, the Jews returned to Jerusalem and were able to worship freely and to set up their communities once again without fear of persecution. And I can say this without exaggeration, that out of the three religions, out of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the members of the Abrahamic faiths, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, were able to worship freely in the land of Al-Aqsa without persecuting each other, without fighting each other, only during the period that was in the hands of the Muslims, starting with Umar radiallahu anhu. Okay? Amjad, can you give me a feel? Is everyone following? Does this make sense?
We're loving it.
Okay. Okay, I hope so. All right. Carrying on. After Umar radiallahu anhu, and then Uthman, and then Ali, I can't go into all of the details right now, it switched hands a couple of times. Right? It went to the Umayyas and the Abbasis and other dynasties, other families, other ethnic groups. But nonetheless, Jerusalem and Al-Quds in general, Palestine in general, remained in the hands of the Muslims for approximately the next 400 to 500 years. Because after the Rashiduns, it changed hands many times. Now, where it becomes significant is that it came to an era where a group, a Muslim tribe known as the Seljuks, they were a group of Turks. This is before the Ottoman Empire. These were actually the predecessors of the Ottoman Empire. Right? These were way before the Ottoman Empire. Around the year 1000, I'm giving approximate dates here, around the year 1080, Jerusalem was now in the hands of the Seljuks. And it was during this period that the events of the First Crusade happened. Okay? And we're going to go into that in just a bit. But I wanted to zoom out a little bit and give you a perspective. Right? It was about 500 years of Muslim rule since the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, in which the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims worshipped freely in Al-Aqsa. This is well documented, with numerous historians from all sorts of backgrounds who attest to this fact. And then that 500 period of peace and coexistence between the three Abrahamic religions came to an abrupt and bloody end with the sudden event of the First Crusades. And this is the background into which our Salahuddin Ayyubi first came into the picture, to rescue the Muslims and the rest of the Ummah, and even the Christians and the Jews, from their grasps. So let's go into a bit of detail with regards to what exactly was the First Crusade. There's a lot of parallels with what's happening right now in Al-Aqsa as well. So in brief, because I want to keep everything short here because I want to get to the main point, which is Salahuddin. Why exactly did the First Crusade even happen? Okay, so do you guys recall, do you remember that I said that the Roman Empire, first it became Christian. The Roman Empire used to be an idol-worshipping empire. It used to worship Jupiter and Saturn and some other gods, idols. And then they adopted Christianity. Not the Christianity of Isa alayhi salam, but the Christianity that believes in Shib, that believes in the Trinity, and that he's the Son of God. Ya'udhu billah. After adopting Christianity, the Roman Empire split into the East and the West because it was too difficult to maintain both together. The West fell. Right? There was a group of Germanic tribes that came in 476 AD and destroyed the Western Roman Empire. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued to exist. Now, the Pope, Pope Francis just passed away recently. If I were to digress a little bit, Pope Francis, overall, it seems like he was a good person. And we're grateful that he spoke out on behalf of Palestine. Unfortunately, he died as a non-Muslim, so we can't make dua for him. But in the history of popes, he's probably amongst the better ones. Anyways, so what exactly is the Pope? What exactly is the Catholic Church? It's a very long history, and I'd love to go into that and map the entire lineage of who they are and where they came from. But for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to mention that the Pope over here, during the Crusades, represented what remained, what was the legacy of the Western Roman Empire, right? The Western Roman Empire. Oops, do I go back? Sorry guys, still trying to figure out how to use this. For this event, I got a new tablet. There you go. Okay. So going back to the Roman Empire, the Western half, the Pope is a representative of the remnants of the Western Empire. The religious figure that overall represents the Eastern half, he's known as a patriarch. You can say that he's a patriarch. Okay? So what happened is that in a place called Anatolia, all right? Anatolia. Oh. Right, which is in modern-day Turkey today. So that's Anatolia. This area used to be the center of the Eastern Roman Empire. And in the 1000s, remember the Seljuks that I spoke about? Those Turkish Muslim tribes? They came to overrun this entire area. They came to almost conquer all of Anatolia. And this was part of the Byzantine Empire. This is where the patriarch, the leader of the Eastern Roman Christians lived. And now he was in trouble because Muslim Turks were taking over Anatolia. So what did he do? He reached out to his old rival, actually, old friend, the Pope in the Roman Empire, somewhere here in Italy. And the patriarch of the Eastern Roman Empire called out to the Pope and he said, help me. These Muslims are taking over my territory, this entire region of Anatolia, and I can't stop them. I need your help. So this brings us to the First Crusade. The Pope, his name was Urban II, he decided to use this invasion of the Seljuks of Anatolia as a reason, as a cause to unite the warring knights and the warring peoples of Europe under one Christian cause and launch this holy mission to go take Jerusalem from these Arabs, from these Turks, from these Muslims. And Pope Urban II, he gave this immense speech in which millions of Christian knights and dignitaries and noblemen had attended, called the Council of Clermont. And he gave a rabble-rousing khutbah, he gave a rabble-rousing speech in which knights started pledging allegiance to the Pope. And in the year 1095, they set out. In the year 1095 AD, they set out now from Europe, from as far as France and Italy, to now march all the way to Jerusalem and take it for the Christians. And I can't go into too much detail right now for the sake of brevity, but what they did, as they moved from France and Italy and other Christian countries under the banner of Pope Urban II, they initiated mass slaughter of people, even fellow Christians who happened to be from the Eastern Roman Empire. Remember, I said that the Eastern Romans had asked for help, and then they regretted it, because what these Western Romans started to do, these Western Christians started to do, is slaughter them on their way. They had such a bloodlust. And by the time they reached Masjid Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, at that time, Jerusalem was in the hands of the Seljuks, in the hands of the Seljuk Turks. Actually, what was happening, I think this piece of information is important. Masjid Al-Aqsa was being in the middle of a tug of war, between the Seljuks, the Muslim Sunni Seljuks, and another entity that I'm going to speak about called the Fatimid Shi'as. They were another power that existed in that region. The Fatimids were Shia, Ismaili Shia, they wanted Jerusalem, and the Seljuks who were Sunni, they didn't want to give it up. Now, because the Fatimids were harassing the Seljuks were not able to hold on to Jerusalem. It happened to come right into the possession of the Fatimids, and then the Crusaders took it from the Fatimids, right? But the entire city was occupied by Sunni Muslims, people of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Thousands of Muslims and Jews and Eastern Christians even lived inside and coexisted peacefully in Jerusalem since the time of Umar radiallahu anhu. What the Crusaders did is that they entered Jerusalem, they defeated their fortifications and the armies, and then they engaged in mass slaughter. They slaughtered and butchered every single Muslim that lived in Jerusalem, right? They say that, and this is from the accounts, by the way, of Christian knights. They left behind diaries and memoirs, so you can read about it, right? So they wrote from their own pen how much slaughter that they had done. They cannibalized some of the Muslims. They cut open the stomach of pregnant women, took out the fetus, and killed the fetus as well. Some people would run to the masjid to go pray because it was their final moments, and then they would mow them down with their sword. One of the Christian knights, he actually wrote that the horses were about ankle deep in blood in the area of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a Christian sector of Jerusalem. After they were done with the Muslims, they went to go kill all the Jews. They went to the synagogues, they burned it to the ground, and they butchered every single Jew that was in Jerusalem that couldn't escape. After they were done with the Jews, then they turned their own knives against their fellow Christians, because these Christians happened to follow a different variation of Christianity from them. They followed variations of Christianity that were more associated with the eastern half, the Eastern Roman Empire. And like this, the Crusaders took Jerusalem in the year 1095. Or you can say, rather, 1096 to be exact. Okay? Thus ending almost 500 years of Muslim rule since our Khalifa Umar radiallahu anhu, ending 500 years of peaceful coexistence between the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians. And as soon as the Christians took power, they implemented all the rules and they banned Jews once again from Jerusalem. They did not give them free access. And the Christians ruled for approximately 80 years in Jerusalem. Approximately 80 years. Okay? Well, actually 91 to be exact. That's longer, by the way, and I want you guys to actually picture this. Right? So they ruled from 1096 to 1187. That's longer than how long the state of Israel has existed so far. Right? So imagine the Muslims living in that period. For us, we study history and we look at 1096 and we look at 1187 when it returned to the Muslims under Salahuddin. It seems like a small blip, just a small event in the larger picture of the history of Jerusalem. But you and I could attest to how brutal this relatively small period can feel. Just imagine the destruction that we're witnessing right now in just the last 1 year, just the past 1 year. Right? But inshallah, just like how during this dark period of 91 years about, Allah had restored Jerusalem to the Muslims, Jerusalem will come back to the Muslims again, inshallah. Okay, anyhow, now getting to the meat of the matter. Now we're fast approaching the main topic, which is Salahuddin Ayyubi and what he did to now kick the Crusaders out of Jerusalem. Okay, but before I do that, we have to introduce 4 main actors, 4 main players in this drama. There are many more, but I'm just going to focus on these 4 main ones for now. Okay, Amjad, how's it looking? Is everyone following? Does it make sense so far?
Yes, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, what about you? Qari, Muhammad, Hamid?
Yes, alhamdulillah. Seems like everyone's following. Alhamdulillah.
Okay, inshallah. The first group that we have to know are the Crusaders. Right? Just to give a little bit of background on who they are, they're just Europeans that came from the Western Roman Empire. They followed what later came to be known as the Catholic Church. Okay, this later on became known as the Catholic Church. And they were not indigenous to Jerusalem at all. They didn't come from there. They came from thousands and thousands of miles away in Europe to establish their kingdom in a far-flung place. And they are able to only do this because the Muslims at that time, who were the majority, I mean, Egypt, Sham, all the surrounding areas were Muslim, just like it is today. They were only able to establish that tiny crusading kingdom, that brutal, tiny crusading kingdom, by taking advantage of the disunity and the disarray of the Muslims of that time. Similar to how the Zionist state of Israel was able to capitalize on the fall of the Khilafah in the early 1920s, and then quickly used the disunity of the Muslims and the economic weakness of the Muslims to their advantage and leverage it to establish their state, despite the fact that it's surrounded on all sides by Arabs and by Muslims. But they won't stay there forever. Muslims won't stay disunited and laying down forever. Okay, the third group are the Fatimids. I had spoken about the Fatimids. Oh, sorry, second group. I have to speak of the second group. The Zingids. Who are the Zingids? The Zingids were a group of Turks. They were Turks as well, just like the Seljuks, but a different tribe. And to make a long story short, they were the first Muslims to respond to the Crusaders after they had taken Jerusalem. The Seljuks were weakened and they were almost gone. The Fatimiyya, your Shias on top of that, and they were very weak. They couldn't do anything against the Crusaders. They actually ended up working for the Crusaders at many points. The Zingids, under a man named Imamuddin Zinki. Imamuddin Zinki, he was the one to inflict the first defeat against the Crusaders a couple of years after they had established their kingdom. And then his son, Nuruddin Zinki, started conquering major portions of Syria, of Sham. And Nuruddin Zinki is considered by historians to be the teacher, the military, economic, and political teacher of Salahuddin Ayyubi. So what happened is that Salahuddin Ayyubi, he, for one reason or another, he ended up, as a boy, him and his family ended up growing up in the palace of Nuruddin Zinki. And because Salahuddin was very talented, and his father was talented, and his uncle was talented, the entire family was talented, they started to rise through the ranks in Zinki's court. And historians mention that Salahuddin Ayyubi was fed on stories and fed on sermons and khutbahs by Nuruddin Zinki about retaking Jerusalem for the Muslims. Every single salah, one narration mentions, every single salah, Nuruddin Zinki would lead the salah, he would turn around, and then he would talk about Jerusalem, he'd talk about Al-Aqsa, and how the Muslims have to take it back. And he worked his whole life trying to prepare the Muslims for this. Unfortunately, this task wasn't achieved in his lifetime, but it did materialize a couple of years after his demise in the hands of his disciple, Salahuddin Ayyubi. So those are the Zinkids. They were Turkish rulers who prepared the ground for the conquest of Jerusalem by Salahuddin Ayyubi and his family. The third group of actors are called the Fatimiyya, the Fatimids. They were a group of Shias, but not like the Shias of Iran today. Okay? You have today in Iran, the group of Shias are called the Imami Shias, or they're called the Ithna Ashari Shias, the 12ers. They believe in 12 Imams. Right? They believe that 12 Imams are the rightful rulers of the Muslims. We don't agree with that as Sunnis, right? There was another branch of Shias, and they still exist today, but they're a minority, they're much smaller now, called the Fatimiyya, or better known today as the Ismailis. And they believe in only 7 Imams. The first 6 that the Shias believe in, the 12ers believe in, the first 6 as well, they agree on that. They differ on the 7th one. And that's why they're called Seveners. Right? And the 7th Imam that they believe in, his name was Ismail, and that's why they're called Ismailis. Now, why are they called Fatimids? Why do they call themselves the Fatimiyya? They claimed that their founder, Ubaidullah, was the descendant of Fatima radiallahu anha. These Fatimids claimed, these Shias, they claim to be descendants of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam through Fatima. But historians have debunked this claim, right? They claim that this is not a true claim, this was fabricated later on. Nonetheless, that's not the focus of our discussion. What we need to know is that hundreds of years before the First Crusades and before Salahuddin Ayyubi's time, the Fatimids started taking a lot of land from the Sunnis in North Africa, and their base was in Egypt. They ruled from Egypt. So they were another major player in that region, and they were the ones who actually had Jerusalem when the Crusaders came and took it from them. And the fourth actor, of course, are the Ayyubids. Who are the Ayyubids? They are the family of Salahuddin Ayyubi. That's his family name. Okay, and we're going to be focusing on them. Right, so Fatimiyas, they are Shias, right? But not any type of Shias. They are Ismaili. or rather seveners, right? Seveners. They believe in 7 imams. The Crusaders, they are from what was the remnants of the Western Roman Empire, right? Today, you would call them Catholic. They're different from the Eastern Romans. And the Ayyubids, by the way, were Kurds. They weren't Turks, they were Kurdish, right? So they were Kurdish, and you can say that they were a sub-family, or you can say they were servants of the Zinkis. They served the Zinkis until they became the ruling family themselves. Okay? Is everyone following? Amjad, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, now moving on. This is where Salahuddin Ayyubi comes into play. Okay, so Salahuddin had a very illustrious life. There are many battles that took place, very interesting to study every single tactic. And there are so many, history books are abound with the stories of his piety and his ibadat and his political maneuvers and his intelligence. It's really hard to summarize that in just 45 minutes, especially because I have 50 minutes left. But what I did, in my humble opinion, and feel free to disagree with me if you have a different opinion. In my humble opinion, Salahuddin's achievements, his life, could be divided into 3 sections. The first one, 3 stages, is his ascent to power, how he rose to power. And the second one is the era of his life that he spent trying to unite the Muslims of that region surrounding Masjid Al-Aqsa in Egypt and Sham. And this was a very difficult task. And the third stage can be summed up as the actual conquest of the Crusaders. He spent the later portion of his life actually attacking the Crusaders. But in order to get to this point, you had to build upon it by first going through the first 3 stages. Okay, so let's dive right into the first one. So his ascent to power. How did Salahuddin Ayyubi even become this powerful figure that came to now rout the Crusaders fully and kick them out of Jerusalem? How did he even end up in this place to begin with? And the answer is quite interesting, because Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah, he actually did not have any aspirations of becoming a king. Historians mention that since he was a young boy, he used to look longingly at the halaqat, at the circles of ulama. And he used to say that I want to be amongst them. I want to be an alim. I want to pursue ilm. I don't want to be a warrior. I don't want to be a king. I don't want to be a sultan or a governor. But his father wanted Salahuddin Ayyubi to get into politics and into the military. Nonetheless, Salahuddin Ayyubi was known for still pursuing ilm side by side. He had Imam Shafi'i's kitabs, like his kitab memorized by heart. So what happened is that Salahuddin Ayyubi's family was working for the Zingids, right? The Zinkis. What did I say about the Zinkis? They were the first family to start trying to take back land from the Crusader kingdoms. And the Zinkis, they sent the Ayyubid family into Egypt. They went to Egypt because the Crusaders were harassing and fighting the Fatimiyya, the Fatimids at that time. We spoke about the Fatimid Shiites. So Nuruddin Zinki sent Salahuddin Ayyubi's uncle. He sent Salahuddin Ayyubi's uncle to go take Egypt back from the Crusaders and help the Fatimiyya. His uncle became successful. He kicked out the Crusaders from Egypt, and Egypt now was in his hands, even though technically it was ruled by the Fatimids. Shortly after kicking out the Crusaders, Shirkuh himself passed away suddenly. And the best person to succeed him was Salahuddin Ayyubi. Actually, what happened is that the Fatimiyya at that time, their so-called Khalifa, their ruler, their Shia Imam, was a guy named Al-Adid. And Al-Adid believed that Salahuddin, because he's a young boy and he's inexperienced, he'll be easy to control, as opposed to anybody else that Nuruddin Zinki installs in that place. So Al-Adid put Salahuddin Ayyubi in that place. Now what did Salahuddin Ayyubi do? Salahuddin Ayyubi played along with this game. He became close to Al-Adid. And quietly, without challenging Al-Adid, Salahuddin Ayyubi started to take more and more control of the affairs of Egypt. And he started to place his family and friends in strategic positions. And a time came where Al-Adid had passed away, And by this time, Salahuddin had already become the practical leader of Egypt. It was already in his hand. There was no one left to oppose him. No matter what the Fatimiyya wanted, they couldn't take it back from this young Salahuddin Ayyubi anymore. As soon as the last so-called Khalifa Al-Adid passed away, the Fatimiyya came to an end. And Salahuddin now became the ruler of Egypt. And what did he do? He had now a base. He had a military base. Did he now attack the Crusaders? What do you think, Amjad? Do you think he attacked the Crusaders right away?
No.
No, he did not. Right? Many rulers would have. Imagine Salahuddin Ayyubi for the last 20 years of his life was fed on stories and legends about how the Muslims had suffered at the hands of the Crusaders and how that it's their mission to take it back. But he was a strategic thinker with a long-term vision. He understood that the Muslims were still not powerful enough and not united enough to be able to manage an assault against the Crusaders. So what he did is that after Adid of the Fatimi Khilafat died, he took over power, he took over kingship of Egypt, and he started to engage aggressively in institution building. He started building madrasa after madrasa. What we would now call maktabs, he started establishing in every masjid. He started pumping millions of dollars in our time into these institutions. And one of the reasons for this is that he wanted to revive ilm amongst the Muslims. The Fatimiyya had started teaching the wrong aqidah of the Shi'as. And Salahuddin wanted to restore the tawheed of the Sunnis and the madhab of Imam Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayh in that region. And he was very successful in doing so. What was the purpose of doing this? By institution building, by building madaris like Darus Salam, like Darul Qasim, like whichever other Darul Uloom you want to mention, Darul Uloom Deoband or Al-Azhar or Medina University, whatever it may be, it creates ideological consensus. And I don't mean every person has to be a Hanafi or every person has to be a Deobandi or every person has to be a Salafi. That's not what I'm talking about. That wasn't Salahuddin Ayyubi's goal. Salahuddin Ayyubi wanted to restore fervent Sunniism, the aqidah of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah in the region of Egypt and Sham and Philistine, and then unite them to fight the Crusaders. So in his ascent to power after taking Egypt, he engaged in institution building and creating ideological consensus amongst the Muslims that in all of Egypt, everyone said, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. They respected the four khulafa. They understood where to get their sources of ilm from the Quran and the Sunnah and nothing else. And then through this network of madaris, of madrasas and institutions of learning, Salahuddin started pumping this idea of fighting on behalf of Allah and kicking out the Crusaders through these major arteries. So what was the result during his ascent of power? Securing a base in Egypt. That was the result of the first phase of his life. Before that, he didn't have a base. He was just a servant of the Zinki Empire. So he secured a base in Egypt, and then after securing his base, he moved on to his next phase. And that was to unite the Muslims of both Egypt and Sham and the surrounding areas so they can encircle the Crusaders, cover them on all sides. And during this time, he could have launched attacks against the Crusaders, but he refrained. What he did instead is that he embarked on a strategy of economic vision. So the first stage, you can say that it was more based on intellectual achievements, intellectual endeavors. And the second one, more or less, was with regards to building wealth for the Muslims. And we'll touch more upon this subject tomorrow, inshallah, when I speak about the Ottomans. Anyhow, so what did Salahuddin Ayyubi do is that he took control of the Red Sea. Here, let me show you exactly. It's easier to picture this. So the Red Sea. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Red Sea. How do you... Well... Oh, finally. There you go. No? Anyhow, so you can see the Red Sea over here. That's where the Red Sea is. Egypt is on this side, on my left. and that's where the Red Sea is. He took full control of the Red Sea. He took control of Hijaz, where Mecca is on the coast. And in doing so, this was a genius move. In doing so, he was able to now secure trade. See, in the Red Sea, that's where ships would pass, and the Crusaders had control of this area. He cleared them out. He took control of the Red Sea, and then he started to accrue wealth from all the trade, from all the ships that were moving through the Red Sea. Right? And today, even, the Red Sea is a very strategic place in order to make money. So he started to accrue a lot of wealth and finances through the Red Sea development. And he started to now prepare financially for the invasion of the Crusader kingdom. Along with that, he knew that he had to obtain other parts of that area that belonged to other Muslims. So there, after Nuruddin Zinki passed away, what happened was that his nephews and some of his relatives wanted a piece of his kingdom, each one. And Salahuddin understood that if Nuruddin Zinki's nephews and his sons, they all take a piece of the empire, the Muslims are going to remain fragmented. They're not going to remain united. So through diplomacy, through political maneuverings, he was able to convince the princes one by one to give up their claim to parts of Nuruddin's empire in Iraq and in Sham. And then Salahuddin took it. Some of them put up a fight. Some of them didn't want to give up to Salahuddin Ayyubi. They wanted to be the kings of their respective areas. And then Salahuddin had no choice but to actually use military strategies to be able to take them. And in other places, he conducted truces with the Crusaders to avoid war for the time being. So whenever the Crusaders started to attack, sometimes he would strike a treaty with them. And there must have been many ulama, many Muslims, many of his own political colleagues who were upset. Why would you strike truces and treaties with the Crusaders? And normally Salahuddin would remain silent, but history vindicated him. It's because he was playing for the long game. He would strike temporary truces to gather strength for the Muslims. There was a unique event, or a rather horrific event, that happened during this period where Salahuddin was trying to unite the Muslims. And if he acted rashly, it would have completely dismantled all the hard work that he was doing. What happened was that there was this crazy crusader, one of the most powerful ones. His name was Reynald de Chatillon. Reynald. To give you a picture of who Reynald was, I can't think of a better picture, but he was somebody who used to do wild things. He wouldn't take anybody's advices, and sometimes he would even act against the king. You can think of Donald Trump of the Crusaders, all right? Just a very wild card. And what Reynald de Chatillon did is that he actually took a contingent and he started to make towards Medina. And he said, Ya'udhu Billah, Reynald de Chatillon, the Crusader, said that I will go to Medina and I will dig up the camel herder from his grave. Ya'udhu Billah, he's referring to Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I will dig him up from his grave and I will burn his corpse. And when Salahuddin Ayyubi heard this, he stood up from his throne and he took an oath that Reynald de Chatillon will meet his death at my hands. But still, Salahuddin Ayyubi did not focus on invading the Crusaders. Rather, he sent the ships that he had in the Red Sea to completely demolish Reynald de Chatillon's forces, and that's why they never reached Medina. What Reynald de Chatillon also did is that the Hujjaj, the Hajis who were going, they're innocent. They were on their way from Egypt and Sham to go perform the Hajj. Reynald de Chatillon intervened. He captured these Hujjaj, he stole their possessions, and he beheaded them. He killed them. And again, Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah, took an oath that Reynald de Chatillon will meet his end at his hands. But still, Salahuddin Ayyubi did not act significantly. He launched some few minor incursions here and there to scare the Crusaders, but not a mighty invasion. Any other ruler who would have been thinking on emotional lines would have already invaded the Christians. But Salahuddin understood that the Muslims still were not united enough in order to manage an assault. But what was the result of this second period? He was able to convince the Zinkis to give up their territory, sometimes taking it by force. He took most of Sham, almost all of it, all of Syria, Aleppo and Mosul, and now he was able to encircle the Crusading kingdom. The Crusader kingdom was completely surrounded on all sides. Egypt on one side belonged to Salahuddin. Syria on the other side belonged to Salahuddin. Hijaz on the other side belonged to Salahuddin. The Mediterranean Sea on the coast belonged to Salahuddin. Where are you going to go now? Now Salahuddin, after 20 years, see, the first thing, his ascent to power started in 1167 AD, actually 1169 AD. And by the time he was ready to make a major invasion of the Crusaders, it was in 1187 AD, approximately 20 years later. Now he initiated his conquest of the Crusaders. Inshallah, I'm going to end off quickly, but let me just give you an idea of how he did so. There are many battles that happened in this period, but I'm just going to highlight one battle, okay? Because this battle, I believe, properly encapsulates and it summarizes the overall strategy and vision and wisdom of Salahuddin Ayyubi. So what did Salahuddin Ayyubi do? Let me change thing again. Oh, actually, I have the picture saved here. Right, there you go. Okay. Amjad, can you see the map clearly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me turn on the laser here. Okay. So everyone see, that's Jerusalem. That's where Masjid Al-Aqsa is, in the land of Philistine. All right. On either side, Egypt, and on the north is Sham. It all belongs, that's Syria. That all belongs to Salahuddin. I'm using a modern map, by the way, but it serves the same purpose. What Salahuddin did is that now that he has the Crusaders surrounded on all sides, he could have made it for the jugular. He could have gone straight into Jerusalem, right? He could have just came from Syria and marched straight to Jerusalem. Or he could have gone straight from Egypt and come to Jerusalem. Or come from Hijaz, which is Mecca and Medina, and come straight to Jerusalem. He didn't do any of that, right? Because what this would do is that the Christians, they were heavily concentrated in Jerusalem. There were hundreds of thousands of Christian warriors and knights and fighters in Jerusalem. If the Muslims, even with all the force that Salahuddin had acquired, if they were to try to now siege Jerusalem, many Muslims would die. A lot of money and time would be wasted. So what did Salahuddin Ayyubi do? Instead of arrogantly and short-sightedly go straight for the jugular, which is Jerusalem, the prize, he played the long game. See this area over here? That's called Tiberias. Okay, it's Lake Tiberias. In Tiberias, there was a fort. There was a fort that the Christians had. And the Christians never thought that Salahuddin Ayyubi would attack Tiberias, because Tiberias, the fort over there, had no strategic value to Salahuddin. He didn't need it, right? It had nothing there was nothing there that would actually help him. However, Salahuddin knew that the rulers of Jerusalem, the king and his right-hand men, even Reynald de Chatillon, who threatened to desecrate the grave of the Prophet ﷺ, their wives and their families used to live in luxury here. That's where they were. So what Salahuddin Ayyubi did is that he launched a siege of Tiberias. He laid siege to Tiberias. And when news got to Jerusalem, the Christians, it made them go nuts. The king of the Crusaders, his name was King Guy, spelled G-U-Y, King Guy, and his right-hand men, they immediately started summoning the knights. And, sources mention that he summoned hundreds of thousands of them. And he was hell-bent on emptying all of Jerusalem, going straight for Tiberias to rescue his family and to fight Salahuddin Ayyubi, who would dare do such a thing. Now, the advisors of King Guy kept telling him, "O King of the Crusaders, don't go to Tiberias. It's a trap. Don't you know Salahuddin by now? He's a clever guy. He wants you to take the bait. Don't leave Jerusalem undefended." But King Guy did not listen. And Reynald de Chatillon egged him on. I told you he was a wild card. He egged King Guy on. And the Crusaders started to make their way, right, in this pattern, because, it's a very hilly area, towards Tiberias, to fight Salahuddin. Now Salahuddin was very, very smart. What he did is that he didn't directly engage the Crusaders, but rather he told the Muslims to now start pursuing the Crusaders, right? From afar, from the mountains, from the hills. Don't be visible to them, but just continuously shoot arrows at them. Just 24/7 shower arrows on them. What's the purpose of this? If you guys have ever seen a picture of a knight, he's covered neck to toe in armor. Do you think that arrows are actually going to make a difference to him? No, right? It's just going to make a dent. But what it does is it creates psychological warfare, right? The whole time they're marching through the deserts towards Tiberias, taking many days. It's incredibly hot. and there isn't any water source, and every few seconds, the sound of ding on their armor. They can't even get a night's sleep because Salahuddin's men keep raining arrows down onto their encampments and they keep following them. So imagine spending days without sleeping, being hit by arrows. On top of that, what did Salahuddin Ayyubi do? Salahuddin Ayyubi then poisoned the water wells. Anywhere there was water where they could have stopped, he poisoned them so that they couldn't even replenish themselves and quench their thirst. On top of that, what Salahuddin Ayyubi did is that in strategic places where the wind would blow, he set fire to those places so the wind would carry the plumes of smoke towards them. So imagine over about a week, the Crusader army, they're marching slowly with arrows raining down on them. They can't get a sip of water because everything is poison. And black plumes of smoke are constantly blowing their way. And then, after arriving near Tiberias exhausted, Salahuddin Ayyubi left the Lake Tiberias unpoisoned. He left it as it is. And the Crusaders, hundreds of thousands of them, finally getting water after 7 days. Half of them are already dead. They started rushing towards the Lake of Tiberias. And it was at this moment, when the exhausted Crusaders were just focused on the water, Salahuddin descended with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and completely decimated the Christians. This famous event is known as the Battle of Hittin, and it took place in July 1187. The Battle of Hittin, July 1187. But this really encapsulates the long-term type of strategy Salahuddin would use. He could have gone straight for the jugular. He could have gone straight to Jerusalem. Instead, he drew out the entire army of Jerusalem to Tiberias, picked them out bit by bit, slaughtered all of them in Tiberias, and once they were done, he took Reynald de Chatillon, he killed him with his own hands, executed him, he took King Yi, held him prisoner, and then Salahuddin Ayyubi took his army, his victorious army, and made his way to Jerusalem, which he then conquered after a 2-month siege. Okay? So, to summarize the Battle of Hittin, he lures the Crusaders out of Jerusalem, harasses them en route through arrows, smoke, and poisoned water. He slaughters them, the exhausted, thirsty, tired Crusaders at Tiberias, decimating the entire army, now leaving Jerusalem open and empty. And when then Salahuddin came to Jerusalem, some narrations mention that there was only a couple of dozen knights to defend Jerusalem because their short-sighted king had emptied everything out on an emotional whim. And that is how Salahuddin Ayyubi, 2 months after the Battle of Hittin, in September, I believe, 1187, approximately 91 years after the First Crusade, he had reconquered Jerusalem. So to summarize his strategy, Salahuddin Ayyubi had 3 phases, according to my humble assessment. The first one was where he secured power in Egypt, right during his ascent. Second was where he fought to unite the Muslims through a combination of diplomacy and military might. And third is to now leverage the ideological unity he had carefully created and the economic advantages that he had slowly accumulated over 2 decades. So he leveraged that to now mount the assaults on the Crusaders that he was able to conduct with relative ease because of the position that he was in. And this led to eventually the full conquest of Jerusalem. Now, after this, Jerusalem more or less stayed in Muslim hands from almost 1187 until 1948, which was until 1948. Well, actually it was in the 1920s, but 1948 is when Israel was founded and Muslims had lost most of control of that area. So I'll leave you guys with a question if I can take questions. I'm sorry, I'm almost over the limit. Where do you think we as Muslims are right now? Which stage are we in? Are we in the ascent period where Salahuddin was creating a base and he was creating ideological consensus by investing in institutions, Islamic institutions, and creating madaris and educating Muslims? Are we in the union phase where a group of educated Muslims across the empire are now trying to come together and create the finances and the economic means to be able to fund what's next? Or are we at the conquest stage? Right? That's a question I'll leave you with. But gleaning from the life of Salahuddin Ayyubi and the situation of the Muslims, I think we can assess and try to glean lessons and move forward from there, right? In my humble opinion, institution building is something that we have to heavily invest in right now in order to prepare the ground for the future conquest of Jerusalem once again, inshallah. Okay, I'll end off here for today. Sorry, Amjad, is there a time for questions?
I think we have like 5 minutes for questions.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sorry, I think we have around 5 minutes for questions, inshallah.
5 minutes? Okay, I'll try to take one question. Let's see. All right, let me just share my screen again. Oh, can I speak on the Hashashin? Interesting question. Okay, who are the Hashashin? I'll keep it very brief. The Hashashin were another group of Shias, extremist Shias. They were Ismailiyas as well. They were kind of different from the Fatimids, but they were related to them. And they're called Hashashin because rumor has it that they became a cult, a group of cultic warriors that would engage in political assassinations for money. They were basically bounty hunters. And they had this esoteric type of belief, which was far, from the original teachings of Islam and even from Shi'ism. And rumor has it, it's not proven, but rumor has it that in order to become initiated as one of the Hashashin, you have to take in heroin and go through this trance. And after the psychedelic experience, you would become one of the Hashashin. And the Hashashin were known to assassinate very key figures in the Islamic Empire for money, and they tried to make multiple attempts on Salahuddin Ayyubi's life as well. Imagine if they had succeeded, Jerusalem would probably have eluded the grasp of the Muslims. By the way, the word assassin actually comes from the word Hashashin. It's taken from that, and that's what they're known for. Okay. I feel that throughout history, Jews have been persecuted, killed, and generally disliked. What is it about Jews that people just don't like? That's an interesting question. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to explain all of it, but I'll tell you this much, okay? Initially, remember that Jewish history, and in my humble opinion, original Jewish history, I'm talking about the early period under Sulaiman alayhi salam and the Jewish kingdom, is actually our history. Because this was the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were the followers of the prophets, which we are the inheritors of those true muwahidun, those true monotheists. And they were persecuted simply because of their tawheed by the pagan empires of that time. Later on, Christians started to blame the Jews for their belief that Isa was killed. They blamed the Jews for that, so they used that as a pretense for the Jews to persecute them. But an interesting theory is this, See, because they were already hated by the Christians, and they were blamed by the Christians for supposedly killing Isa alayhi salam, and of course Isa alayhi salam was not killed. They were shunned from many government offices, right, in Europe and in other areas, and they developed, they couldn't, rise through the ranks through government positions. So the theory is that they got into handling money, and that's why they became very powerful through creating the banking system. And then later on, from like the 1800s and eventually into the Nazi period, brutal Nazi period, they started to, the Germans, for example, started to blame the Jews for all of society's ills. They started saying that, oh, these wealthy bankers are controlling our society and holding us in debt. But in my humble opinion, obviously, this is not a reason to persecute an entire population. Let's assume that's true, let's say that the Jews were controlling the banks of Germany, but that's not a pretense for slaughtering 6 million innocent women and children, even if some of their descendants do it to us today. That's not how Muslims do. And again, that's also reminiscent of Salahuddin Ayyubi. What did Salahuddin Ayyubi do when he took back Jerusalem? His example is famous. He spared the Christians, and he spared everybody that he could have persecuted in memory of the first crusade. He let them all go. Actually, there's a saying of Salahuddin Ayyubi I'd like to share before I end off. Forgot to share that here. Mention that right now. Again, it points towards his long-term strategic vision and encapsulates the general Muslim approach to how they manage the Holy Land. Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah, where is it? Yes, this is what he said, okay? It's majestic words. Salahuddin Ayyubi said, I warn you against shedding blood. Salahuddin Ayyubi said, I warn you against shedding blood, indulging in it, and making a habit of it. For blood never sleeps. I'll say it one more time. I warn you against shedding blood, indulging in it, and making a habit of it, for blood never sleeps. And I believe the fact that Salahuddin Ayyubi spared the Christians and let them go back to Europe was part of his long-term strategic vision in maintaining Jerusalem for the Muslims. Because right after that, many more crusades did happen, but Salahuddin Ayyubi was able to beat them back. He didn't give them an excuse to now justify trying to kill Muslims even further. Okay. A very good question. I'll end off with this question. What can non-scholars and non-rulers do in supporting the ascent and union of the Muslims? That's a very detailed question. I mean, I would like to answer it in detail. Unfortunately, time won't permit. I believe that as people who don't hold the reins of power, we could work on a grassroots level in trying to revive and create ideological consensus amongst the Muslims. And I don't mean on a sectarian level. I mean just the basics of the Quran and Sunnah. We have to get Islamic education on a higher level. And in order to do that, we have to start, as a community, start investing into what we call the arteries of our civilization, which is the Darul Ulooms. And once that starts happening, I believe that just by funding and by focusing all our efforts in creating places like Darul Salam or Darul Qasim or Darul Deoban or Al-Azhar, it will start to then produce the leaders eventually that will now come to positions in which they can make the strategic decisions that will have a major impact on the Muslims. I believe on a grassroots level, that's what we can do. With regards to kings, by the way, see, today, okay, let's take the example of Erdogan. Does everybody here know who Erdogan is? Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, right? It's a common question that I get. Why doesn't Erdogan, who has strengthened, the Turkish military, why doesn't he invade Gaza? Why doesn't he help the Palestinians? And it's a fair question. So the short answer is that in a reasoned political analysis, he's still not capable of doing so. And I'll tell you the reason why I'm saying this. Imagine that he gets 100,000 soldiers into that area. They're going to need air support to help those foot soldiers. And their air support right now relies on American-based technicians in order to run. So imagine you launch this invasion, and now you need air support to make sure that nobody bombs these guys. But America's going to be like, we're not going to do that. You're not going to hurt our friend Israel. So it's not practically possible. But here's the thing. See, people like Erdogan, people like Mohammed bin Salman, whoever's in power, good or bad, what if they use Salahuddin Ayyubi's long-term strategic vision as a pretense, as an excuse to actually not do the right thing? How do we know what they're saying is true? So what can we do? In my humble opinion, regardless of whether there's a strategic vision or not, that's not our business. Our business is to pressure our leaders, to pressure those who are in power to make it happen. And how it's going to happen and what's the strategy, that's their business. But if they can't take the pressure, if they feel upset that the general Muslim population is pressuring them now to do something about Gaza, then, the simple answer is get out of the hot seat. If you can't take the pressures of power, don't be in power. Move out and go sell ice cream. As a normal general Muslim like myself, wherever I can, I'm going to pressure our rulers in whatever form is possible in order to create that fikr and manifest it, to create the Salahuddin eventually came. The Prophet ﷺ said that if you see evil being done, you can do one of three things. You can either stop it with your hands, or you can speak out against it, or you can hate it in your heart. And we can all assess our own situations and see to what degree we're able to help. Can we do something about it with our hands, or can we speak out against it, or are we really at that level where we can only hate it in our hearts? Okay, inshallah, we'll end off here for today. I do apologize if the message was a bit difficult to receive. You have to understand I'm working here blindly, not being able to see your wonderful, beautiful faces. But inshallah, hopefully in the future, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordains, I can come in person, and I hope to have another discussion like that one day. Okay, wa akhiru da'wana an alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Amjad, do I have the green light to stop now?
Yes, I believe you do.
Okay. All right. Okay. Jazakallahu Khairun. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Barakatuh.